Is this thing on?
Travelling from pasture to pasture, the Huns had a particularly creative relationship with the natural world. Hun treasure is dominated by exquisite animal forms.
Is this thing on? Yes. I've just taken a shower. Call of Duty Black Ops 6 it drops in an hour and a half. In an hour and 26 minutes. I have it pre-downloaded already, so I thought I would catch myself up because I've only played Black Ops 1. See if I can find a Black Ops story so far. Full Call of Duty Black Ops.
The reason why I'm making this is because Black Ops story is confusing. The order that this goes in is Black Ops 1, Black Ops Declassified, Black Ops Cold War, and then half of the story of Black Ops 2, and then we get to Black Ops 6, with no mention of Black Ops 3 or Black Ops... It's confusing.
That is confusing.
The Call of Duty Black Ops franchise has a long and complex timeline that charts a course through our own real-world history into a high-tech near future that's very different to our own.
Okay, that's GameSpot.
So the Call of Duty Black Ops franchise has been a fairly polarising one, to say the least. The games were set amongst the backdrop of the Cold War, a subject...
We'll go to GameSpot.
The Call of Duty Black Ops franchise has a long and complex timeline that charts a course through our own real-world history into a high-tech near future that's
Is this
very
allowed?
different to our
This
own.
is allowed, right?
And with 6 mainline games and a couple of handheld spin-offs, the series has a surprisingly dense timeline for you to wrap your head around. The twisty-turny series has a bombastic narrative that spans over 120 years and even overlaps with key historic events in our own real-world timeline. But how exactly does it all tie
Who is
together?
that fucking guy?
Well, it's certainly not straightforward, and in the case of Black Ops 3, it's downright confusing. But broadly speaking, the timeline looks a little something like this. It doesn't help matters that there are a couple of key character cameos that hint at a wider shared universe between the various Call of Duty subseries. While I'll be going into detail about these characters and the parts they have to play across the video, I will be keeping this timeline focused on the Black Ops franchise and the games that definitely take place within its timeline. And with Black Ops 6 further expanding the timeline, there is no better time to dive back into the lore of the series than now.
George.
So join me as I break down and explain the full Black Ops timeline.
I remember numbers. But when they put the knife in the guy's hand, it's like the very first scene.
The Black Ops timeline kicks off during the Second World War with the introduction of an iconic character that will cast quite the shadow across a good chunk of the franchise. Yet, World at War introduces us to Captain Viktor Reznov, voiced by the decidedly
I have
not
played World at
Russian
War.
character actor Gary Oldman, during the Red Army's brutal fight against the Nazis at the Battle of
a good one.
Stalingrad. Alongside Private Dmitry Petrenko, who we first meet among the dead of a Nazi
Maybe the
onslaught,
first one I
the
ever
pair
played.
fight their way through the burning
Thing.
ruins of the Russian city while playing the odd game of cat and mouse with enemy snipers. Oh, and Reznov gets a classic action movie escape from an exploding building. They eventually link up with their Soviet comrades and launch an
So
attack
bad.
that ends with the death of Nazi General Heinrich Amsel, the chief perpetrator of the massacres against the Red Army. From here, the Soviet
That
campaign
truck.
jumps forward to the tail end of World War II, with the Red Army pushing the Nazis
Okay.
back into the heartland of Germany. We catch back up with Reznov and Petrenko when the former saves the latter during an attack on Silo Heights. From there, the pair command a tank and then
didn't
board a
realize it's
train
the
en
same
route to their
guys from
final
World at
destination
War.
of Berlin. And across a brutal week of action in late April 1945, Reznov and Petrenko fight their way through hordes of Nazis all the way to the steps of the Reichstag building, and they finally reach the building. But just as Petrenko is about to hoist the flag of the Soviet Union, he's shot and wounded by a Nazi soldier. Reznov jumps in to save the day, literally, by slicing the enemy to shreds before cutting down the Nazi flag and aiding Petrenko to raise the hammer and sickle of the Soviets. And that heroic conclusion brings the
Cheers.
Soviet campaign in World War to a close.
As long as can't take this up.
Before we move on, it has to be mentioned that World at War also has an American campaign, which sees the US Army fighting across the Pacific theatre of war against the Japanese Imperial Army.
Right.
But as none of the core characters ever appear again, that is except for a cheeky
We just
cameo
learned about
by
that,
Sergeant
chap.
Roebuck, and none of the action really has any bearing on the wider Black Ops narrative, I'm going to skip right past it here. Chances are you already know what happened anyway. Next up on our timeline is the original Black Ops, which largely takes place during the height of the Cold War in the 1960s, that is, except for one vital mission that takes place in late 1945. While the larger narrative of Black Ops takes place via a frame story, which sees the main protagonist Alex Mason regaling many of the game's missions via flashbacks, the first mission, chronologically speaking, is one called Project Nova. This 1945 set operation sees Reznov and Petrenko team up once again to track down a mad Nazi scientist who's been busy creating a bioweapon in the frozen wastes of the Arctic Circle. The context for this mission has largely been established in the wider game's narrative by this point, but in short, the mission centres around the backstory of how the game's big bad, Major General Nikita Dragovich, and his sadistic right-hand man Lev Kravchenko come to get their hands on a deadly bioweapon simply known as Nova 6. In the 1945 set mission, they team up with the lad who built Nova 6, Dr. Friedrich Steiner, to complete an unholy trinity of bad eggs. In the process of storming the Nazi Arctic base and securing Nova 6 for their treacherous superiors, Reznov and Petrenko suffer greatly, particularly poor Petrenko, who is effectively used as a for Dragovich to see the effects of Nova 6 firsthand. Reznov fares slightly better though, when he's able to escape during a British ambush on the Arctic base. While escaping, he rigs the ship containing Nova 6 with explosives in the hope of destroying the bioweapon. But as we find out later on in the game, he's not exactly successful.
Bioweapon.
Either way, he's eventually captured by his compatriots, and for his supposed betrayal against his countrymen, he's locked away in the Vorkuta prison. Anyway, from here we jump forward 16 years to the year 1961, and the first mission of Black Ops. But first, as I mentioned earlier, the bulk of Black Ops is told via flashbacks from the somewhat unreliable narrator that is Alex Mason. Mason has had a rough time of late, and he wakes up strapped to a chair and surrounded by screens with mysterious numbers on them. He's at the mercy of a pair of shadowy figures that demand the secret behind the numbers, which will help give them information regarding the whereabouts and plans of Dragovich. And as a result, they hurl a metric ton of questions at the confused CIA operative. Their questions trigger a series of flashbacks, which lead us straight into the first mission of the game, which finds Mason, alongside Sergeant Frank Woods, another big player across the Black Ops timeline, tasked with assassinating Fidel Castro in Cuba. The squad storm Castro's complex in Cuba and eventually corner and kill the Cuban president. Or so they think. Yet, in the aftermath of the mission, Mason is face to face with the real Castro, who's happy having a chit-chat with Dragovich and Kravchenko. And for his efforts, Mason is carted off to Russia and chucked into Vorkuta prison and a fortuitous meeting with one Viktor Reznov. While in Vorkuta, Mason and Reznov become close acquaintances. More on that later on. And the pair manage to escape the prison during a prisoner uprising. While Mason is able to get away on a motorbike, Reznov lures the pursuing Russian soldiers away on a truck. I wonder if we'll ever see that mad lad again. Either way, it's 1963 by this point, and a newly freed Mason links back up with his CIA handler Jason Hudson. And the pair head to the Pentagon for a meeting with none other than JFK himself. The president gives Mason fresh orders to assassinate Dragovich and dispatches the operative to Russia to sabotage the Russian space program and kill the Soviet terrorists.
Jonathan F. Kennedy.
But before he's sent packing on his mission, Mason has something of a brief blip whereby he envisions himself killing JFK. All will be revealed
Why
in
would
time.
anybody ever want to do
Hudson
that?
and Mason ship out to the Soviet spaceport in Kazakhstan and successfully destroy the Soviets' rocket. But during the mission, Dragovich manages to escape, and he goes into hiding for the best part of 5 years. But before we jump forward those 5 years to the Vietnam set missions, there's a level from Black Ops Cold War that forces itself into the timeline just ahead of Mason's search for Dragovich.
Is the Vietnam War technically
from the memory of Cold War's main protagonist,
contained
Bell,
within the
this
larger Cold War?
Vietnam-based interlude sees a squad of Marines led by Russell Adler, much more on him
It's
later.
just a US-Russia
Tracking down
proxy war.
important intel on
Isn't that
another
every war?
Soviet ne'er-do-well who goes by the name of Perseus, also much more on him later. In short, they're able to secure the intel, which alerts them to the fact that Perseus and his troops are mounting an ambush to steal an American-made nuclear bomb. Adler, Bell and co. hightail it over to the US base that's babysitting the nuke, which they secure, only for their chopper to go down in Viet Cong territory. And in the final last-ditch effort to rescue the nuke, the team orders an airstrike near to their position, which sounds like a recipe for disaster if you ask me. Either way, the strike lands and yeah, it's pretty danger close, but the nuke somehow survives. Anyway, we'll catch up with these fellas in the 80s. Now it's back to Mason and co. Okay, we're back with Mason and Hudson in 1968, and the pair are deployed to Vietnam to join up with their old mate Frank Woods.
Woods, you look like having shit.
Some kind of shit in the jungle. Snap, baby.
Good to see you.
Me too.
And so from here, Black Ops really plays out the greatest hits of cinema's rendition of the Vietnam War. Huey helicopters blasting out rock music? Check. Russian roulette? Check. Marlon Brando? I bet Activision would have tried if he wasn't dead. Anyway, Mason and co. are there to seek out any leads to Dragovich, and they eventually discover that there's a Soviet defector knocking about, and it only bloody turns out to be Viktor Reznov. Or is it? The defector hands over intel that leads Hudson on a merry song and dance to Hong Kong, all in pursuit of a scientist called Dr. Clark who worked under Dragovich. They manage to reach the Mad Doctor, who reveals to them the whereabouts of one of Dragovich's secret bases in the Ural Mountains. But before they can get the meaning behind the damn numbers broadcast that is at the heart of Dragovich's game plan, Dr. Clark is shot and killed. Anyway, back to Vietnam we go as Mason and Woods continue their quest to track Dragovich down. After fighting their way through Viet Cong territory, they're eventually dispatched to check out a crashed plane that supposedly contains a batch of the Nova 6 virus. But in the process of their mission, they're captured by the Viet Cong and taken deep underground. Meanwhile, Hudson is busy following up on the lead from Dr. Clark, and this leads him deep into the Ural Mountains and into contact with Dr. Steiner, albeit remotely. Steiner is looking for a backdoor out of his work with Dragovich, and he cuts a deal with the Americans to trade intel about Dragovich's comings and goings in exchange for his own safety. Back with Mason and Woods, they naturally escape after a botched game of Russian roulette and make their getaway in a daring chopper escape en route to Kravchenko's base. And who does Mason bump into once again at the base? Yep, his mysterious mate Viktor Reznov. Or does he? Mason, Woods and Reznov race through the base and eventually confront Kravchenko, who gets stabbed by Woods. But the sneaky Soviet has pulled the pins on a quartet of grenades, and Woods sacrifices himself by throwing himself and Kravchenko out of a window to their supposed deaths via a Big Bang. From here, Mason and Reznov discover the location of Dr. Steiner separately to Hudson, and they set off for a spot of revenge on Rebirth Island, home to the facility creating Nova 6. And so Black Ops speeds towards its conclusion, well, one of them at least, as we get the action that unfolds on Rebirth Island told from two different perspectives. The first sees Reznov and Mason storm through Steiner's base en route to the Doctor, who is promptly shot by the vengeful Russian. Or is he? Well, no. You see, this is where Black Ops narrative pulls the rug out from beneath our feet, with the big reveal that Reznov has been a figment of Mason's imagination all this time. Or has he? Yeah, he has. Let me explain. You see, in the second version of events that we see on Rebirth Island, we see Hudson's perspective, and well, he witnesses Steiner's death at the hands of our hero, Mason. And from here we finally discover the mysterious people behind Mason's interrogation with all the screens and numbers and whatnot. Yeah, Hudson unveils himself as one of the interrogators and gives Mason the mother of all info dumps. It turns out that nobody has seen Reznov since the escape of Vorkuta, and he's assumed to be dead. But his impact lives on in what happened to Mason during his time at Vorkuta prison. You see, during his incarceration, Mason was effectively brainwashed by Dragovich and Steiner, in a bid to turn him into a sleeper agent that can then cause a bit of chaos stateside. We already saw a glimpse of this when Mason daydreamed the act of shooting Kennedy, but somehow Reznov has at some point managed to override the programming of Mason's brainwashing to give him new orders: kill Dragovich, Kravchenko and Steiner. And Mason has been a good little soldier by following his orders to the letter. Anyway, we're not at the game's main conclusion yet. After Hudson gets Mason back on side, he reveals that Dragovich has actually got a load of sleeper agents across the US already, and they're all primed to unleash Nova 6 across the country. With Mason their only lead to Dragovich, he finally recalls some long-lost intel in his brain that leads them to Dragovich's base of operations aboard a ship. And with all the might of the US Navy backing them up, the team moves out to cut off the head of the snake. Hudson and Mason eventually corner Dragovich, and Mason confirms the kill by simultaneously strangling and drowning the man. Yeah, that'll do it. And while that's basically the end of the game, there are a couple of little teasers that close things out. Firstly, we get a reel of archive footage of JFK, with one of the images showing Mason suspiciously close to the US president. While Black Ops doesn't out and out say that Mason killed JFK, it also doesn't say he didn't. And then on top of that, there's the information that your friend and mine, Frank Wood, survived his encounter with Kravchenko, but is now detained at the Hanoi Hilton. And with that, the original Black Ops comes to a close.
Okay, Black Ops DS.
Happening concurrently to the events of
Like-
Black Ops are the small screen special ops of the Nintendo DS game of the same name.
Oh,
While
shit.
Black Ops DS largely takes place in 1968,
Okay, this
during
game
the
looks
Vietnam
like
War,
shit.
there are a few missions that take place in the years preceding the US's campaign in Southeast Asia.
Obviously.
For starters, there's a mission set in
DS.
1967 which sees a US strike team heading into Cuba to rescue our old mate Alex Mason, as well as Black Ops DS's chief protagonist, Sergeant Michael Shaw. While the rescue mission is something of a failure, the pair both manage to escape on their own steam.
Why
From
did they
here,
make
Black Ops
this?
DS sees Shaw head to Vietnam to join the search for Nova 6, which sees him link up with a Russian defector called Yuri Razlov, who has a handful of 1963 set missions, and Captain Patterson. They come up empty-handed on the Nova 6 front, but after fresh intel comes their way, they're rerouted to sabotage a Soviet submarine base, which is primed to transport Nova 6 to its final destination in the USA. And with that, the Black Ops timeline is done with the swinging 60s.
Black Ops 2 1973.
With the 60s behind us, we enter into a new decade, and our first port of call are the origins of a future villain, Raul Menendez. Only 10 years old at this point, Raul Menendez is a scared young boy who comes up against the might of the US-backed Contras in his home country of Nicaragua.
Shit.
In an incident that kickstarts his deep hatred of the United States, Raul and his sister Josefina are trapped in a warehouse that is then set alight by an American contingent in a bid to claim the
Why would
insurance
anybody
money.
have a deep
The
hatred of the
resulting
United
fire
States?
completely disfigures poor
Doesn't make any
Josefina, to the
sense.
point where Raul thinks she is dead. And believing her dead, Raul then seeks to take his own life by slitting his throat with Josefina's locket. Only she awakes to stop him before he can see it through. While Raul escapes the warehouse with a deeply scarred Josefina, the experience firmly sets him on a warpath against anything and everything American.
Sounds like it. Never mind.
Next up on the timeline are the 70s set mini-missions of the handheld title Black Ops Declassified. The story is
Alright, we gotta play Black Ops 2.
held in 1990
That
by a
shit
CIA
sounds-
analyst called Ryan Jackson, which is an incredibly on-the-nose reference to Tom Clancy's fictional agent Jack Ryan. Anyway, the 10 core missions of Declassified largely take place across the 1970s, except for one which dips its toes into the 1980s. First up, we have a pair of 1975 set missions that take place in Vietnam and star our surviving friend Frank Woods. Then the game jumps ahead to 1976, where the still employed brainwashed operative Alex Mason is tracking down intel from a defector behind the Iron Curtain in East Berlin. Next up, we're back with Woods for a trio of USSR set missions in 1977 that sees an attempt
I
to
did
revive
play a little bit
Project
of Cold War,
Nova.
but I
Woods
did.
puts a stop to the attempts and destroys the facility for good measure. And lastly, for our time in the 70s, we have another pair of Alex Mason mission. The first, an escort mission taking place in Nicaragua, and the second, a search and rescue mission in Afghanistan. And Declassified rounds out its tiny campaign with the aforementioned 1982 set mission that stars an unnamed CIA operative. This mission directly ties into the future events of Black Ops 2 and sees an infiltration of the Menendez cartel, which leads to the assassination of Jose Luis Menendez. But with Menendez Sr. out of the picture, it leaves space for his son Raul to step up, and we'll catch up with this bad lad later on.
He seems so bad.
Right, we've actually skipped ahead a year there with Declassified, so it's time to rewind the clocks back to 1981.
So the
The
US
main events of Black
bombs
Ops
his
Cold War.
house and his
A new
sister burned to
decade
death.
requires a new team,
in his
led by
arms.
the aforementioned Russell Adler, who here looks like a sort of Robert Redford on steroids, which I guess kind of feels like the right guy.
And that fostered a deep hatred of the United States.
Anyway, he drafts in a new look team, which alongside the new recruits includes a few familiar faces than the likes of Mason and Woods. The main protagonist of the game, though, is a mysterious new player-created CIA agent, simply codenamed Bell, who's been brought in due to his past experience encountering the big bad new threat at the heart of the Cold War during the Vietnam War. Said threat goes by the name of Perseus, who in this instance is less Greek hero and more Soviet villain, as the mysterious Russian terrorist is on the warpath to undermine the free world. And so Black Ops Cold War launches into a globe-trotting espionage adventure where Adler and his team systematically
it doesn't mean
hunt down
anything
Perseus.
anymore.
They take
I mean,
the sites
never
either
meant
side of the
anything.
Berlin Wall while tracking a Russian mob boss with ties to their quarry. They get embroiled in a bizarre Soviet training regime in a mock Americana. Hell, Mason and Woods even visit the old haunt of Dragovich's base in the Ural Mountains. Time and again, they come away empty-handed in their search for the elusive Perseus. That is until they venture into the belly of the beast by infiltrating the Lubyanka building, the HQ of the KGB. With help from a Russian double agent called Dmitry Belikov, they finally discover the full ramifications of the threat posed by Perseus, and it goes by the catchy name of Operation Greenlight. Adler, Bell and Co. learn from the CIA's very own Jason Hudson that Operation Greenlight is in fact a US-led initiative, which saw bombs planted in every major European city as a countermeasure against a potential Soviet expansion across the European continent. Perseus has managed to find his way into the launch codes for the bombs, which means he can effectively blow up the entirety of Europe and blame it all on the US. And all of this leads to the shock revelation behind the true identity of Bell, when Adler tries to push the agent for more information on Perseus from the Vietnam War. Reality and memory come crashing together in a bizarre sequence where Bell tries to recall his meeting with Perseus in 1968, only for a far stranger truth to emerge. You see, Bell was never in Vietnam, including that operation to save the nuke I mentioned earlier, and that's all because Bell is actually one of Perseus's key agents. In an earlier mission to capture a terrorist on a Turkish airbase, Adler, Mason and Woods all witness Bell being shot and left for dead. But despite this, they retrieve Bell from the wreckage and nurse him back to health. And when I say nurse him back to health, I mean brainwash the ever-living shit out of him. And so we get the neat twist that Bell has been going through the whole game brainwashed with the aim of coaxing critical info on Perseus out of him. When Bell's memory finally comes back to him, he has a simple choice: to reveal the whereabouts of Perseus or to trick his new team with a false location. The non-canon ending, the one in which you lie to your new team, gives us a bizarre conclusion, which sees you gunning down Mason, Woods and all en route to a victory for Perseus. But the canon ending sees the team all travel to the Solovetsky Islands to dismantle Perseus's plans for Operation Greenlight by destroying the transmitters he intends to use to blow up the bombs. And with his plan foiled, Perseus goes back into hiding, with the main team never truly coming face to face with that adversary across the game. And Black Ops Cold War's campaign comes to a close with the final clifftop scene between Adler and Bell.
Major
While
spoilers.
Adler admits that Bell is a hero for what he's done to counter Perseus, the niceties come to an abrupt end when Adler whips out a pistol and supposedly shoots his new recruit dead. The screen cuts to black before we can confirm the kill though. Right, before we barrel on into the multiplayer component of Black Ops Cold War's narrative, there is one great big elephant in the room that I need to address before we continue.
Yes.
Yeah, there's a certain character that pops up during the KGB infiltration mission that, well, kind of throws a few major spanners into the works of this timeline. In the section of the KGB mission where you play as Belikov, you're invited to a little chinwag with the big brass of the Soviet Union, a meeting with Gorbachev no less. But who else is in attendance? Well, besides Kravchenko, who also apparently survived that explosion during the original Black Ops. No, not him. Also in attendance is one Imran Zakhaev, who you might know as the main villain of the original Modern Warfare game. To confuse matters even more, he's also in the rebooted Modern Warfare, but in a less prominent role. Now, this opens up a whole can of worms on the Black Ops timeline, as it potentially suggests that there's a shared universe between Black Ops and Modern Warfare. There's a few problems here though, as the two distinct branches of the Call of Duty franchise don't exactly sit well on the same timeline, largely because of the wildly different world politics and events at play in the two series, and the differing technological advancements as well. We also see a photo of Imran Zakhaev in the rebooted Modern Warfare, which shows him looking roughly 30 years older than he does in his Cold War cameo, so chalk that up as another inconsistency. Most crucially though, Activision haven't confirmed a connection between the two separate brands either. And, well, this leaves Zakhaev's cameo as a KGB
Is it possible that guy just
something
looked
of a
like him?
curiosity. As for this timeline, I'll be sticking with just the main Black Ops games, and so won't be speculating as to how the Modern Warfare trilogies, either of them that is, fit into the chronology. Anyway, with that little detour out of the way, time to move further into the 1980s with the multiplayer of Black Ops Cold War. The seasonal content for Cold War moves the action ahead to 1984 and sees a new faction of Perseus' operation emerge, led by the fellow who was in charge of the Nova 6 production line on Rebirth Island. This guy goes by the name of Viktor Kuzmin, or more commonly by his codename Stitch, and in short, he's after revenge on Russell Adler, who captured and tortured him in the wake of the CIA's strike on Rebirth. Stitch and his team raid the CIA's West Berlin safe house for intel on Adler, and Stitch ends up leaving a message that coaxes the team to a shopping mall in New Jersey. Oblivious to the fact that it's a clear trap, Adler and his team take the bait and naturally they get ambushed with Adler himself getting kidnapped. Woods mounts a rescue operation, which sees a CIA strike team assemble and travel to the jungles of Laos in search of their missing leader. Only when they get there, they're drawn into a false hunt for a local Nova 6 production line by one of Stitch's agents called Naga. The team eventually rally and figure out the deception of the Nova 6 fake-out, but it's too late to rescue Adler, who's been moved on to a new location at Verdansk, the original Call of Duty Warzone map. Verdansk aside, Stitch's plan moves up a gear when he sends two of his agents, Wraith and Knight, to infiltrate Yamantau in the Ural Mountains. They manage to gather some crucial intel before they nuke the base to Kingdom Come.
Oh shit.
Back at Perseus' base of operations in Verdansk, Adler is rescued by Woods, but it's of no concern to Stitch, who begins to move forward with his ultimate plan of creating a greater Russia. He kicks his plans into gear by forcing a satellite constellation known as Jumpy to crash into two specific locations, Verdansk and Algeria, which will free up a broadcast frequency that he plans to use. Adler and team scramble to the Algerian crash site, and after some gung-ho heroics from Adler, he's able to nab one of the data recording devices from the crashed satellite, although he lies about its existence to his team. With the broadcast frequency cleared for business, Stitch sent another of his team, an agent codenamed Kitsune, to a NATO broadcast station in Germany, where she uploads a new numbers broadcast sequence. As she's initiating the sequence, Woods and the CIA strike team arrive to intercept her, but just as they arrive, the sequence activates and awakens a pre-programmed signal buried within a handful of sleeper agents on Woods' team. In the ensuing carnage, Woods is shot, but he's ultimately able to escape by the skin of his teeth. Somehow still living and breathing, Woods meets up with Hudson to discuss the mysterious circumstances behind the missing data recorder from the Algerian crash site, and this leads them to the conclusion that Adler is somehow implicated. With Adler compromised, Hudson orders Woods to bring Mason into the fold for a cosy reunion with their rogue CIA colleague, and they eventually bring Adler in for questioning in a familiar-looking interrogation room. And it's here that everything starts to become clear. You see, while Adler was imprisoned by Stitch, the Perseus agent had him brainwashed with the numbers broadcast to do his bidding, hence the shady business with that rogue data recorder in Algeria. With Mason on the scene, he helps decode the programming of Adler's brainwashing to bring the agent back to his senses. Meanwhile, Stitch has problems back in Verdansk, courtesy of a few explosives left by Adler while he was on a secret project in the Soviet territory. While Stitch is able to defuse one of the bombs, a handful of explosives still go off, laying waste to a good chunk of Verdansk. And with Adler rid of his brainwashing, he joins a strike team which comprises Woods, Hudson and Mason, with the goal of dismantling Stitch's best-laid plans. The team eventually tracks Stitch down to a gravesite in Verdansk where Adler confronts the terrorist, and it's here that we learn that Perseus has supposedly been dead for over a year, having died from cancer in 1983. Stitch regales Adler with a good old-fashioned bad guy monologue about how Perseus is more than just one man, and that his actions have now changed the face of the world. And in response to his little speech, Adler gifts him a bullet in the head, although the cutscene cuts to black like it did with Bell's death, so who knows whether Stitch is dead or not. And Black Ops Cold War rounds out its seasonal content with a character cameo that further confuses the timeline, and again hints at a wider shared Call of Duty universe. Yet, we get another clashing of worlds as Adler and co bump into one Captain Carver Butcher, an ex-SOE operative who also founded the Task Force Vanguard during World War II. While this is his first and only appearance in the Black Ops timeline to date, the character played a prominent role in both Call of Duty World War II and Call of Duty Vanguard, which has led many to speculate that both of those games are also a part of the Black Ops timeline. And yeah, they might be. There's no real argument for or against them being folded into the Black Ops chronology, but neither game has any real bearing on the wider story at play in this timeline, hence why I didn't include them earlier on in the video. And more likely, Butcher's inclusion at this point was probably intended as a wider connection within Warzone between Cold War and Vanguard, as Butcher goes on to talk about an island called Caldera, which became the main theatre of conflict in Warzone. Anyway, my head hurts and it's time to get back on track.
So on Black Ops 2.
Okay, we now reach the decade-spanning events of Black Ops 2, which is set across two distinct time periods and features two different Cold Wars. While most of Black Ops 2 takes place in 2025, there are a handful of missions that take place in the twilight years of the Cold War between 1986 and 1989. These missions, told by a flashback by an aging wheelchair-bound Frank Woods, detail the CIA's run-in with the Nicaraguan drug lord and terrorist Raul Menendez. And so the 80s set story kicks off in 1986 when Hudson visits a retired Alex Mason, who's living with his son David in the wilds of Alaska. Mason the
So
elder
terrorist
is
is just anybody who
but Hudson takes
disagrees
him
with
back
the
in
United
with a
States.
rescue mission in the heat of Angola.
Months ago.
You see, our old pal Frank Woods has gone missing during a mission to dismantle an arms smuggling ring. And with the life of his former colleague on the line, Mason agrees to re-enter the fray.
I'm just trying to
Hudson and
figure it
Mason
out,
eventually
guys.
track Woods to a pretty grim container floating down the Cubango
Pretty
River.
grim.
Woods is basically
I
half
would
dead,
call that
so the mission
pretty
takes on an
fucking
extra
grim.
level of
Oh my
difficulty
God.
as Woods and Mason race to get the hell out of Angola. En route though, Mason bumps right into Raul Menendez, and in an altercation with the Nicaraguan, Mason shoots and deforms the drug lord. I bet that endears him even more to the Americans. Either way, the trio managed to escape Angola, and Woods reveals that Menendez was responsible for the capture and torture of his team. From here, the action relocates to Afghanistan, with the CIA actively seeking to capture and kill Menendez, who's in the Middle East a profiteer from the Soviet-Afghan War. With support from the Afghans, the CIA strike team is able to capture one of Menendez's key agents, who only bloody well turns out to be Lev Kravchenko. Seriously, that man keeps cropping up like a bad penny. Woods interrogates the hell out of Kravchenko, while Mason is gripped by some side effects triggered by Reznov's reprogramming of his brainwashing, specifically the orders to kill Kravchenko. And here's where Black Ops 2's choice-based gameplay starts to make itself known. If you resist Mason's urge to kill Kravchenko,
Nice.
the Russian reveals that Menendez has moles within the CIA.
So in Black
But the
Ops
end
6
result of
there
this
must
encounter
be...
is the same. Woods straight up murders
There's
Kravchenko.
already choice-based
In the
gameplay in
ensuing
Black
chaos,
Ops 2.
the
There must
Afghans
be.
betrayed the
Like,
CIA team and leave them for dead in the desert.
hopefully there
They
is.
are eventually rescued by two mysterious travellers, one of whom Mason
Choice.
hallucinates as his old mate Reznov, because that mad bastard will never likely leave him. With Menendez still at large, the CIA teams up with the Panamanian army to launch a full-scale attack on the
illusion
Nicaraguan
of choice.
compound. While they manage to fight through his huge private army, they are ultimately unsuccessful in their goal of capturing Menendez, and that is largely down to the rogue actions of Frank Woods, who justifiably wants to get revenge on his past tormentor. In a fit of pure rage, Woods storms through the compound before confronting Menendez with a live grenade, which supposedly kills the drug lord in a vast fireball. But despite Woods and Mason being led to believe that Menendez was the one carried away in a body bag, it's later revealed that it was in fact his sister Josefina who died in the explosion. And that's all down to the fact that Menendez and the Panamanians, specifically their general Manuel Noriega, are in league together. And that leads us right into the final and most devastating 80s set mission of Black Ops 2. You see, Woods and Mason are tasked with capturing Noriega during a sting in Panama, but nothing is as it seems. When Woods and Mason are separated, Woods is tricked into shooting and killing Mason, who he's tricked into believing is Menendez. Naturally, all of this has been orchestrated by the Nicaraguan terrorist who has kidnapped both Hudson and Mason's son David. It turns out that the whole mission was a fake, set up by Menendez, who has coerced Hudson into getting Mason and Woods where he wants them.
Wow.
With Woods believing he has killed Menendez, he goes to confirm the kill, only to get the shock of his life when Menendez himself shows up and shoots Wood in both kneecaps, crippling him for life.
Damn.
And this horrifying turn of events ends with Woods witnessing the death of Hudson as well, only to be spared alongside David, although Menendez promises to come back for Woods at some point. Now, as Black Ops 2 has various different endings and outcomes, there's actually a version of this scenario where Mason survives, leading to a lot of speculation that the character could still be alive for future games. But with Black Ops 6 being set in the early 1990s, and the fact that we see a wheelchair-bound Woods in the trailers, it pretty much confirms that the true canon version of
Early
events is the one in
1990s.
which Mason dies. But the tagline for that game
Which
is
war is
"The
that,
truth
Gulf
lies,"
War?
so maybe Mason is alive
Yikes.
after all, and we're all being played for fools. Anyway, speaking of Black Ops 6, Yeah, Black Ops 6 slots its way into the timeline here, in the wake of the devastating conclusion to the 80s flashbacks from Black Ops 2. As of the making of this timeline, Black Ops 6 has not yet been released, but Activision have confirmed that the game is directly tied to the 80s flashbacks of Black Ops 2, which means Mason is dead. Or is he? The truth lies, remember. And Woods is now confined to a wheelchair. Black Ops 6 takes place in 1991, in the midst of the Gulf War. The Cold War is over and Saddam Hussein's invasion into Kuwait is in full swing. And with the classic characters taking a backseat or straight up dead, Black Ops 6 introduces us to a whole new team of fresh recruits. With Woods taking a more behind-the-scenes role, he works with his new protege, a guy called Troy Marshall. And as Jason Hudson is also dead, Black Ops 6 introduces us to a new CIA handler, who goes by the name of Jane Harrow. And this trio are thrown into your classic conspiracy spy thriller, when an operation goes sideways and forces the team to go rogue against a mysterious force that has infiltrated the CIA. In order to get to the bottom of the shadowy conspiracy, Woods, Marshall and Harrow recruit a new team, which includes tech expert Felix Newman, and of course there's the much vaunted return of Ryan Russell Adler, who's back after going AWOL for a good chunk of time, and, well, can't be trusted. With Adler back on the scene, he brings intel about a mysterious power within the CIA, who go by the catchy name of the Pantheon, and their ultimate game plan of triggering a devastating weapon. Naturally, for a Black Ops game, there are numerous player choices and decisions to be made across its barnstorming campaign, which will likely lead to different narrative outcomes.
Right.
What those outcomes are, though, we'll just have to wait and see when the game launches.
In and out.
Okay, we finally reached the near-future sections of Black Ops 2, which largely take place in 2025. But first, some important build-up. Black Ops 2's future sections start in earnest in 2014 with the founding of a revolutionary movement called Cordis Die, which is led by a figure calling himself Odysseus. You have precisely no guesses for telling me who that mystery person is. It's Menendez, obviously. Anyway, over the next decade or so, Menendez slowly grows the ranks of Cordis Die to the point where they are strong enough to basically trigger a second Cold War between the superpowers of China and the United States.
That'll never happen.
More accurately, NATO and the Chinese-led Strategic Defense
That'll
Coalition,
never happen.
SDC. Menendez
So, if the United
manages
States
this
is
by
in NATO,
destabilizing the Chinese stock exchange via a cyber attack, which forces the country to start throwing its economic weight about. And by 2025, Cordis Die becomes so vast that it boasts over 2
it's
billion
Germany,
members,
United States, Israel against
and so
Russia, China, the rest of Europe.
Grown David Mason and his colleague Mike Harper
What
travel
happens
to
to
the
NATO?
Vault, which is basically a retirement hair for ex-CIA operatives to chat to our old mate Frank Woods about his run-ins with Menendez. And it turns out that his last run-in with the Nicaraguan was actually
Proxy
quite
war in
recent,
Ireland?
as Menendez actually visited him in the retirement home for old spies. And this catch-up spurs Woods into a good old-fashioned reminiscing session with Mason Jr. and Harper,
It'd be a good
the
place
events of
for,
which I've already covered in the
military
80s
base.
section of Black Ops 2 earlier on. And from here, the future sections of Black Ops 2 kick off properly, and a lot of it boils down to key choices that the player makes along the way, but I'll be largely sticking to the versions of events that are considered canon. In short, it follows the Joint Special Operations Command, or JSOC for short, as they
load
try
your
to track
choices
down and
from
apprehend
the-
Menendez in a bid to stop Cordis Die from tearing the world apart. At the point
I don't
here,
have
played
any.
are Mason, who goes by the codename of Section, and Harper, and they kick things off by raiding a Cordis Die compound in Myanmar, which brings them the intel behind Menendez's core plan. You see, Menendez has unearthed a relatively new element by the name of Celerium, which through science is capable of causing some pretty severe computer viruses, the kinds of viruses that Menendez could harness for another cyber attack. After spying on Menendez in Pakistan, the team discover that he's after something, or someone, known as Karma, who turns out to be an expert hacker by the name of Chloe Lynch. Section and Harper track Lynch down to a giant floating oasis called the Colossus, where they have to fight off an attempt by Cordis Die to kidnap Lynch. Section and Harper fight through and eventually rescue Lynch, but as I said before, there
I
are
hope all of Black
alternative
Ops 6
places
is the
where
Gulf War.
can be
That's
taken by
fucking
Cordis
sick.
Die instead. Anyway, JSOC are finally successful in their attempts to capture Menendez when they catch up to the revolutionary
That's a good
terrorists in Yemen. And to be fair, the bulk of the work is actually done by one of their local spies, a lad called Farid, who then gets thrust into the awkward
Lots
position
of
of having to
moral
either
ambiguity.
kill Harper or give himself up and be killed. And here's where the player's choices really start to matter, as the choice made here really affects the next couple of missions, specifically who lives and who dies. The canon version of events, however, sees Farid kill Harper in this pivotal moment, and while he's racked with guilt over what he's done, he's calmed by Section when he arrives to apprehend Menendez. But even with Menendez behind bars aboard the USS Barack Obama, a distinct threat still looms. And of course, Menendez doesn't last long in cuffs as he's freed by a mole that he's placed within JSOC, one of Section's teammates by the name of Salazar. With Salazar's betrayal allowing Menendez to run free, a lot happens in a short span of time. Firstly, poor Farid cops it at the hands of Salazar when he sacrifices himself to save Lynch. And from here, all hell breaks loose as Menendez hacks into Obama's mainframe, overpowers it with one of his handy viruses, and then hijacks the US military's army of drones. He sends them all over the world, but specifically targets major cities in both the US and China, which leads to both nations going on high alert. And Black Ops 2 reaches its action-packed conclusion with an all-out drone attack on the streets of downtown LA. Section and Co. lead the charge by protecting the US president en route to hunting down Menendez himself, who they finally track down to another Cordes DA compound in Haiti. And once Section finally confronts and captures Menendez, we reach the point that triggers Black Ops 2's many endings. They all differ depending on whether Lynch is still alive and what choice you make regarding the fate of Menendez, but the canon ending sees Lynch survive and Section kill Menendez. But while his death and Lynch's survival ultimately sees Menendez's cyber attack fail, the Cordes DA leader becomes a martyr across the world. Yet, with his death confirmed, Cordes DA releases a YouTube video of their leader inciting people to riot across the world. And with 2 billion members, that's one hell of a riot. This leads to a global revolution of sorts, with widespread anarchy across the world, and sets the stage for future events in Black Ops 3 and 4. But regardless of that, the true ending of Black Ops 2 will always be the mid-credits joke one that sees Menendez and Woods, now free from his wheelchair, rocking out on stage with the band Avenged Sevenfold, as that's the world we all want to live in, surely?
Black Ops 4 is in the 2040s.
Right, we're moving even further into the future with our next game in the timeline, Black Ops 4, which has an extremely messy narrative. And that's saying a lot, as it doesn't actually have that much of a story, due to the fact that Black Ops 4 was the first Call of Duty game to forego a campaign mode. Okay, so the story in a nutshell sees an overly confusing conflict between a pair of sisters, Savannah and Jessica Mason, who are the daughters of David Mason and naturally the granddaughters of Alex Mason. Savannah is in charge of a mysterious experiment called Project Blackout, which is toying with the concept of resurrecting the dead by creating archetypes, which are basically clones to me and you. 5 of these archetypes are classic Black Ops characters, including Frank Woods, Jason Hudson, Alex Mason, Victor Reznov and Raul Menendez, the latter of whom is somehow also involved in the running of Project Blackout. Anyway, Savannah and Jessica come to blows over the morality of the project, and their fight escalates to the point where Savannah shoots and supposedly kills her sister.
What?
I say supposedly as nothing is as it seems in this bonkers side story in the Black Ops canon. Of all people, it's Frank Woods who tells Savannah that her sister is still alive. And even more weirdly, Savannah and the Woods archetype are in some sort of relationship, which just leaves me with a lot of questions. Anyway, Jessica does eventually emerge again, but this time as a threat, and this is where Black Ops 4 brings in its specialists. You see, the bulk of the game's cutscenes come in the form of intro videos for the 10 specialists that Savannah recruits to help tackle the threat that Jessica poses. Chief among them are Donnie, Ruin, Walsh and Erin Battery Baker. Ruin and Battery have prior experience with the Mason family, having been on an earlier botched mission with Savannah's sister Jessica, although whether that mission ever actually took place is up for debate. And all of this leads to, well, nothing actually. You see, the core narrative through line of Black Ops 4 never got a proper conclusion, so we never got to see the outcome of the battle between Savannah and Jessica. And as we'll see when we come to Black Ops 3, clones aren't a known thing, so who knows what happened to Project Blackout. There are also a handful of bizarre story threads that don't really go anywhere, most notably a weird dynamic between the archetypes of Woods and Mason, which straight up just doesn't make much sense.
Black Ops 3.
Alright, we finally reached the furthest point in our timeline, Black Ops 3, which takes place in 2065 and is, well, something of a total mind. Okay, first the clear-cut stuff. The world in Black Ops 3 has been heavily influenced by the fallout from the death of Raul Menendez at the end of Black Ops 2. And in the time since that pivotal day, the planet has found itself on the brink of ruin. With widespread anarchy, constant global upheaval, and the ever-looming threat of climate change, the superpowers of the world have united to form 2 key global alliances, the Winslow Accord and the Common Defence Pact. On top of this, there have been huge technological advancements in the field of directed energy weapons, with the development of a system known as Directed Energy Air Defence, or DED for short, which has rendered the world's air forces completely useless. As a result of all of this, another Cold War has kicked off, the 3rd in a century by my count, and covert operations are back on the menu, hence more Black Ops well into the 21st century. Anyway, from here on out things get confusing and convoluted. You see, after the first 2 campaign missions, which are set in 2065, the rest of Black Ops 3 can be played in any order you choose, including the final mission of the game.
What?
And that's because it's all a dream.
Taylor.
No, seriously, let me explain. In short, AI simulations. The longer answer, however, will naturally take a little more time to break down. Okay, for starters, in Black Ops 3 you can create your own character, and you jump into the shoes of this new recruit during a Winslow Accord Black Ops mission to rescue the Egyptian Prime Minister from a faction known as the Nile River Coalition. Yeah, there's a lot of global alliances going on in the 2060s. Anyway, the player character, who can be male or female depending on the player's choice, and their CEO, Jacob Hendricks, are successful in rescuing the Egyptian leader, but things go a little sideways for the player during the exfiltration. And when I say sideways, I mean the player gets both of their arms ripped off by a robot. Oh yeah, there are also full-on robots now knocking about in the Black Ops timeline as well. The player character is rescued right at the last minute by a lad called Commander John Taylor, who is, well, the key to all of this. You see, despite their extensive injuries, the player character is nursed back to health with a liberal dose of technology now augmenting their body. And while the rest of the game seems to play out with your cyborg recruit running ops across 2070, the reality is quite different. That's because the player-created character actually dies as a result of their robot attack, and the rest of the game is basically an AI simulation playing out in their saviour John Taylor's consciousness. So in short, the events you play out in Black Ops 3 are a simulation of Taylor's past adventures that take place before the game itself kicks off, and we'll get to them in just a second. Firstly though, the key to how all of this works is a new piece of tech known as the Direct Neural Interface, or DNI, which sort of allows all the various CIA members to stay networked within their own minds. The DNI comes under attack by an AI system called Corvus, which basically came into being due to some shady human experimentation with the DNI by a tech company called the Coalescence Corporation. Still with me? If I'm honest, I'm struggling a bit. In events that happened before the game in 2060, a massive explosion takes place at the Singapore HQ of Coalescence as a result of Corvus coming online, and this explosion leads to a chain reaction that pumps an unhealthy amount of Nova-6 into the surrounding areas. The net result of this? 300,000 deaths. Yikes. Fast forward to 2064 and Taylor and his team, made up of Jacob Hendricks and Rachel Kane, are sent in to investigate a CIA black site in Singapore when another CIA team goes dark. And this leads them down the rabbit hole to discovering the truth behind Corvus. In short, it hinges around the hunt for a lad called Dylan Stone and his missing CIA team, who are all implicated in the deactivation of the CIA site in Singapore. In their hunt for Stone, Taylor and co venture deep into the Coalescence Corporation HQ in Singapore, where they discover that Stone is trying to leak intel about the CIA's involvement with the shady tech company and its links to the Singapore disaster. With the CIA compromised, Taylor and his team have to go it alone, and this sends them on a merry old adventure to track down Stone. In the process of doing so, they methodically eliminate Stone's team members as they encounter them, which drives a wedge between Taylor and Hendricks, who starts to question the morality of their mission. It all comes to the boil in a final confrontation between Taylor and
questioning
Stone
the morality
at
of
the
your
Lotus
mission.
Towers in Cairo, where Taylor finally eliminates the rogue CIA agent, albeit with critical injuries that leave him near death. Hendricks comes to the rescue and Taylor is saved and hailed as a hero by the CIA. And his devastating injuries are healed with the augmentation of cybernetics and a DNI implant. Okay, we're coming back full circle to the rescue of the Egyptian Prime Minister, and hopefully things will start to become a little clearer. Taylor becomes the head of a new cyber ops team and is assigned a new crew, all of whom are kitted out with DNI implants. Only when the player character dies at the hands of their horrible dismemberment, the AI Corvus is reawoken within their DNI. As Taylor had linked his DNI with the player characters, and also with his whole cyber ops team, the Corvus AI is able to infect his entire team, which slowly leads to their deaths. And here's where we can start to connect the dots, as the player character's consciousness lives on through Taylor's DNI and lives out a simulation of events that are similar but also different to Taylor's hunt for Dylan Stone. And it's this simulation of events that makes up Black Ops 3's campaign. Only events play out a little differently when the simulation gets to Lotus Towers, where Taylor fights back against Corvus by ripping out his own DNI implant, but ends up getting killed by Hendricks anyway, who has also somehow become infected with Corvus. And this brings us to the mysterious and very confusing place that is the Frozen Forest, which is basically Corvus's attempts at creating a simulation of life after death. Anyway, Taylor and the player character reunite within the forest and are finally able to successfully defeat Corvus to the point where the link between the player character and Taylor is severed. Man, I need to have a sit down in a dark room. Black Ops 3 really is an absolute headache of a narrative to decipher, but there are a handful of clues to the true meaning behind the simulation. For starters, you might notice that each mission starts with a ream of text scrolling along the bottom of the screen. And if you pause during this, you can read the details that make up Taylor's story. Not only that, but each mission has its own protocol code, such as Alpha, Echo, Omega, etc. And if you take the first letter and put all of them together, they give you the gibberish, which is ORWEARETAYL. Or for fans of acronyms, We Are Taylor. And with that bombshell, I'm going to call time on the Black Ops timeline. Thank you so much for watching this breakdown of the Black Ops chronology. I hope...
Well, okay. So, most of that is irrelevant. Because it takes place in the future. Black Ops 2, Black Ops 1, Black Ops 2. Seem like the most important ones. And Cold War. Alright. See you.